the reason that I felt in conflict all those years is because I live in a society that doesn't respect each other. I live in a
Mm,
society that considers that okay. Yelling
yes.
at each other is okay. And it's like insulting each other is okay. I'm like, no,
Mhm.
no, it's actually not, I mean,
Yes, that's right.
and taking that into my leadership as a boss, being able to say, whatever you want to do, you're here to grow. And I'm here to support you to grow. And I
Mhm.
respect you as a human. And that's the most important thing. And therefore, whatever I work with you on, my desire is to
Yeah.
do it in a way that helps you flourish.
Welcome to the Audacious Living Podcast, hosted by my man, Audley Stephenson, the Odd Man.
Greetings and salutations. Welcome to the Audacious Living Podcast, where our ongoing goal is to help our listeners live their best audacious lives ever. It's really a pleasure to have you here. If you are joining us for the first time, I say welcome. And if you've been here before, certainly welcome back. And I thank you for taking time out of your day to join us. Now, in leadership, challenging assumptions and beliefs is like tending to a garden. Just as diverse plants contribute to the beauty and resilience of a garden, embracing diverse perspectives fosters resilience and growth in leadership. Andrea Johnson is a seasoned leadership coach with over a decade of experience working with executives and teams to foster self-awareness and enhance leadership skills. In this episode, Andrea shares insights on the importance of challenging assumptions and beliefs in leadership, emphasizing the role of self-awareness in effective leadership. It's a great chat that I'm sure you're all going to enjoy, so let's check it out. Hey, Andrea, thank you for joining me here today on the Audacious Living Podcast. We said before we went live here that we tried a few times to get this, and my schedule got crazy, and your schedule wasn't lining up, and we've been. I think it feels like months, but we're here
Yes.
now. That's the most important thing, and I want to thank you first off, not just for being here, but your perseverance.
Oh, thank you as well. I'm happy to be here, Audley. I think this can be a fun conversation, and I really hope that we can bring some things to your audience that maybe they've never thought about before,
Yeah.
and that will kind of encourage them to grow and to be able to live in an audacious way, right?
Yeah, that's the name of the game here. I mean, we spend so much time on this podcast doing just that, encouraging individuals to live that, best audacious life. And I gotta say, Andrea, like the topic of leadership, hands down, is probably my favorite to discuss. All because of the nuances that it contains.
Mm.
Leadership isn't just one way, and the best evidence of this is that you can line up 10 people and ask them all what leadership means to them, and you're going to get 10 different responses, because
Sure.
oftentimes their viewpoint of leadership is based on their experiences of it. And your experiences sort of form sort of how you see it and moving out in the world. And so that's kind of what my I get excited about. You're a transformational leadership coach, so you're coaching and helping other leaders sort of get to that best level, if you will. And so
Mm.
maybe as a starting point, just to give our audience idea of sort of who you are and the work that you do, you can fill us in a little bit about your background and what's brought you to this point.
Sure. As we were talking before we hit record, I grew up internationally, and that kind of framed the way I viewed the world in good and bad ways. I grew up as a missionary kid in Seoul, Korea, and so I grew up in an international community with lots of people from, like, there were 65 countries represented at my school, and it gives you a very broad and open sense of what it means to just even be human. And then being in another culture where you don't
Mhm,
necessarily speak the language, it
mhm,
can create, has the opportunity to create in you a humility that helps you see the world differently. But I came home to college in Texas
mhm,
and didn't always maintain that because I just really wanted to fit in. I really wanted to be, I didn't want to stand out and be different. I learned early on that when you stand out and are different, in Japan, they say the tallest blade of grass gets cut first. And I'm not the tallest blade of grass. I think I was 5'2" when I really stretched. So I'm small. I'm about 5'1.5", but I have a big personality. Most people say when they see me on camera, they're like, I would have no idea that you were little. Well, I'm a little person, but I have a big personality. And growing up in kind of conservative evangelical circles, that was
Mhm.
never really embraced, right? Women
Mhm.
are supposed to be followers and demure and the
Small,
hostess and mostess,
petite, right.
and I'm of an age as well, right? I'm 57. And so there were certain aspects to being myself that I was not comfortable with. And one of those was having been raised internationally. Most
Mhm.
people don't understand that. I mean, I
Right.
think today's world is very different. But back in the 80s and even in
Oh,
especially in the
absolutely.
70s,
Yep.
nobody got it.
That's right.
And I was seen as just different. Um, but some things happened in my life. I got a job. I actually worked for two amazing universities in medical schools, administration and operations and research administration. I worked at Johns Hopkins. I worked at the University of Virginia.
Yep.
It's a big deal. I mean, these are really good schools. If you had
Sure.
asked me what I was going to do, it had nothing to do with that. And even when I went to move to here to Charlottesville, Virginia, I thought I could never work at the University of Virginia. And of course, I got hired on my first interview. But throughout that career, I learned a lot about myself. I learned that I don't like to manage the status quo. I
Mm.
don't I don't like paper pushing. I don't like being in big organizations. I very much have always identified with the underdog.
Mhm.
And as I grew and through other circumstances in my life, for instance, my mother was diagnosed with breast cancer and we ended up losing her in 2017, but she had a 15-year battle with that. I was
Gotcha.
diagnosed with early menopause, so I ended up adopting my son. All of these things oddly make you who you are.
Yes.
And by the
Yes.
time I hit 50, when I had an 8-year-old adopted son and I lost my mother, I realized I don't want to continue in these things that I don't want to do, like if I don't want to manage. And a
Yes.
friend of mine said, have you heard of John Maxwell? And I said, well, no. What's funny is my husband had, because he was reading leadership books and stuff.
Right. Right. Right.
And if your listeners haven't heard of him, he's like a global leadership
Absolutely.
guru. He's one of
Yes.
the New York Times #1 bestsellers. And she said, you might want to check this out. And she introduced me to this opportunity to become trained under Maxwell's team to be a speaker,
Yes.
trainer, coach. And that opened my eyes to, oh my goodness, I'm not the only one that thinks managing the status quo is not worth it. I'm not the
Right.
only one that sees leadership, like you said, as different. And I was in this environment where leadership meant male, blonde haired, blue eyed, 6 foot tall with a
Right.
master's of
Yep.
business administration, an MBA.
Yep.
And, you know, as a white woman, there were certain things that I benefited from in that system, but I still didn't benefit. And I was given promotions without raises. I was told that I wasn't the funny lady and I needed to keep my mouth shut in meetings. And finally, I was just like, I don't think I want to do this
Right.
anymore.
Right. Right.
And so I decided to take that leap and get certified. And I worked for about 2 years, still employed and doing coaching business and learning how to do training. I did some training in my organization. And I don't want anybody to think that the University of Virginia, there's anything wrong with it. It's a big organization. It does amazing things.
Yes.
It wasn't where I needed to be. And I
Gotcha.
think that's the whole point of leadership is understanding where you need to be, where you need to serve. And you have to do that by starting by leading the person in the mirror. So about 3 years ago, next month, I left and I've been doing this full time.
Amazing.
I have a podcast that I love. I love having conversations with people like you who are curious and interested about growing. And so that's not a super short story, but that's kind of where I come from and why I
Yes.
approach conversations like this with the energy and the excitement that I do.
Well, thank you for sharing your story. And I think for me, in the background is always insightful because then it really gives you an idea of where maybe where viewpoints or styles or approaches are formed. I mean, our experiences shape who we are. Like, this is a reality. Like, we go through a certain set of things, and that's helped shape us. Well, that also means the same for our leadership style. Our leadership
Yes.
style also influences who we are, because our leadership style is part of us, right? And sometimes there's a need to make a division or distinction between, no, I'm a leader, versus, oh no, I'm this person, but they're really one and the same. And so hearing your experiences, and I want to start, actually, I want to go back to your travel experiences, because I think travel does such a wonderful thing in terms of increased perspectives, viewpoints, understandings, different cultures, and none of those things are bad to know or have in the leadership framework. So, I mean, I wonder if you
Right.
can start to talk about how important that has been for you.
You know, I did mention, pardon me. I'm sorry. I did mention that there were ways in which it was good and bad, right? And then
Mhm.
so what I did was I kind of walked away from my what I would just call my heritage of being this third culture kid. I didn't really tell people I grew up in Korea. I didn't tell them I
Mhm.
had traveled all over the world and that my sister's favorite city in the world was Hong Kong, and that I'd been to certain places in Europe and we'd traveled all these different places. And then every time we went back and forth to Korea, we stopped in Hawaii because that sounds privileged, right? It sounds
Right,
like, who gets to do that? I'm like,
right,
well, we
right.
did it on $5 a day, but okay. Um, but being able to, once I hit this level of awareness, right? We need to
Yeah.
understand where we are, this
Mhm.
level of awareness that, as you said, all these experiences make me who I am. And I
Yes.
started to embrace this international viewpoint and worldview. And because when I was 10 years old and we came home for sixth grade, and I was telling people about what it was like for me in Korea, I got overheard, 10-year-old girls, they're just ruthless, right? I overheard, oh, here comes Miss Korea this, Miss Korea that. And I learned very quickly to shut my mouth, right? It's like
Mm,
I didn't want to be the person that they ostracized. I was only there for a
I
year,
see. I
needed to
see.
make friends. I was at least practical and smart enough to figure that out. But as I matured, I looked back and I actually had to grieve a little bit the ways that I had pushed aside that wisdom that I gained when I was young,
Mm,
because being able to see another culture and to understand a perspective that is not my own, for
yes.
people that have a history that is so much longer and deeper and richer than my country, right? I mean, my country not even
Yes,
250
yes.
years old yet.
Right.
And Korea has a written history of 3,000 years. It's just
Mm,
amazing. And so I had to go through a little bit of that grieving process. But once I got through that, I realized there's this richness that comes with the Asian culture.
yes.
I've always had this respect for older people. I have always had this respect. I mean, on the bus, you get up and you let the
Yes,
halibut,
yes.
the old lady, the
Yep.
grandmothers, you let them have a
Yeah.
seat.
Yep.
At 65, they throw a big party and it's called Hangap, and it's like a big party for their seniors, and
Yes.
it's you get to retire and the oldest son takes care of you, and they live multi-generationally even
Yes.
today. I mean, it's a much more modern, but there's just so many beautiful traditions and there's so much respect and honor in the culture. And I recognize now, as I've gone through what I would even consider a period of deconstruction, I look back and I'm like, oh my goodness, the reason that I felt in conflict all those years is because I live in a society that doesn't respect each other. I live in a
Mm,
society that considers that okay. Yelling
yes.
at each other is okay. And it's like insulting each other is okay. I'm like, no,
Mm,
no, it's actually not. I
lots.
mean,
Yes, that's right.
and taking that into my leadership as a boss, being able to say, whatever you want to do, you're here to grow. And I'm here to support you to grow. And I
Mhm.
respect you as a human. And that's the most important thing. And therefore, whatever I work with you on, my desire is to
Yeah.
do it in a way that helps you flourish. I used to interview people for administrative assistant
I,
jobs.
I love that dialogue, by the way, just for the record,
Okay.
before you go on. I absolutely love that dialogue about what I'm here to do as a leader, because oftentimes you'll see individuals who will come into leadership roles and they're so focused on them being able to perform and to manage well
Sure.
and to be right. And the focus isn't on the individual. So when, as you said that, I'm like, absolutely, I agree with you wholeheartedly.
Well, it can't be on us as a leader, right? Because if I had someone say this to me, it's like, if the shepherd is in the other pasture, what good is that what good are they to the sheep,
I love
right?
that.
And it's so, which is so true. And that's
Yes.
many times we do get caught up in that because, really quick, I told my people, this is a launch pad for you. This is not a landing pad. I don't
Yes.
expect you to be here in 3 years. I don't expect you to be here in 5 years. I want to help you grow. What can I do to do that? And so many people just didn't trust it, right? Because in many of our positions, we are, and we do this to people who like are a good sales performer, will promote them into a sales manager. The problem
Right.
is we don't then give them training on how to lead people. So they only know how to perform better. And I've actually gone into retail establishments where they're like, the manager is just pushing their own sales. And I'm like, oh, no,
Right.
no, no.
Right. Right.
Let's
Right.
help you figure out how to grow your people because your individual sales numbers, yes, unfortunately, your boss asks for them. But at the same time, if you promote that in your people, they don't feel like they have to hide them from you.
Yeah.
They want to contribute to the overall sales of the entire organization. And that's just a very small piece.
Yes,
But
it
you're
is.
right, that ability to, and it's one of the reasons I left was because it went against the larger organizational need for, and I understand this too, but a larger organizational need for continuity of work,
Yes.
continuity of
Yep.
having people in the job that have known the department well, and they have what I call institutional wisdom, who've
Yes.
been there and they retire there, and there's a place for that, just not where I need to be. And so I would get somebody, they would leave to go to a bigger job, and my chair would come to me, it's like, why did they leave? What did you do? I'm like, no, I did my job. He's like, no, you didn't do your job. I need that person here. So
Right.
when you can, when you can see that the way you lead needs to mean a different environment, it's okay to go. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with the way you lead, as
Yes.
long as it's not focused on you, as long as it's focused in a servant way on other people, you'll find the right place.
I find, and I'd love to sort of get your take on this, but I think in order to do what we've just talked about very, very well, there needs to be a certain level of awareness, awareness of oneself as well as others. It's funny. I heard this analogy once where awareness is likened to a room with the lights off, and it's got, so you think of the living room, it's got your couch and your lamp and your coffee table, all these things. Well, when you turn the light off, the items are still there in the dark. Hitting the light switch only makes them visible, but they were always there and only
Mhm.
could have been seen when you turn the light on. So it's very similar to that fashion where leaders have to turn on their light switch to understand, what furniture they have at their disposal.
Absolutely. And, as coaches, a lot of times we talk about this word awareness, but a
Hmm.
lot of it is just that's a beautiful example because it's very tangible and people understand it.
Yes.
And the ways that you figure out and turn on the light are using different tools. And I'm sure you've had plenty of people come on here that talk about different types of tools. I use tools with my clients. One of them is called the DISC assessment, and
Okay.
it literally helps you understand how you're wired to communicate. And sometimes that's the easiest place to start, is understanding how you communicate and recognizing the patterns in the way other people communicate. Because once you do, then you can actually start listening better. You can start hearing what they
Right.
say. And so I use different tools with my clients to help them do that. But you don't have to work with a coach to have that light switch turned on. You must be willing, however, to look at what's in the dark. And a lot of times I'll start my workshops with, why don't we want to look inside? Why don't we want to see what's
Sure.
there? And almost every time there's at least one person that raises their hand and says, because we're afraid of what we're going to see.
Mm.
If you think, I love your analogy, if you think in that living room analogy, are we afraid that we're going to turn on the light and it's going to be empty? Are we afraid we're going to turn on the light and there's going to be a monster sitting in the recliner? Are we afraid we're going to turn on the light and it's all going to be tattered? Well, just like a good medical diagnosis, if you know what's there, you can treat it. So most of us don't have scary things in there unless it's things like, oh, this is a torture chair, we need to get rid of that and put a recliner in. Or
Right.
in more realistic terms, a lot of times when we turn on the light switch, we might recognize there are assumptions that we've made, there are things that we've been conditioned to understand. I call them
Right.
our ABCs, our assumptions, beliefs, and conditioning. And when we turn on that light, we're willing to look at not just the assumptions, but we're looking at
Yes.
why we have them and what's underneath them.
Hmm.
And, then the work starts, right?
Right. Right.
Then the vacuuming starts, then the dusting starts, then
Yes.
the pulling
Yes.
off the sheets to reveal what's there. And
Yes.
the reality is, it's a beautiful process. And it makes us better people. It makes us better wives, husbands, partners, parents, business owners,
Yep.
bosses,
Yep.
employees, team members. It makes us all better. And so I love that you brought up awareness.
When you talk about the assumptions and the beliefs, it really kind of goes back to sort of the beginning of the conversation. We talked about experiences, because
Yes.
oftentimes those experiences help fuel the assumptions, the things that we believe, the things that we move forward on based on those understandings. The key in all that, though, is knowing when it's time to question those things. And so what you just talked
Mm.
about is around, listen, it's perfectly okay to question. I remember hearing a story once, and I've told this story on this podcast before, and regular listeners will be tired of hearing about this story. But I'm going to tell it again because you haven't heard before, Andrea. But I heard a story of a young woman who they had a tradition in their family when they made turkey, and they used this big uh, roasting pan, and they used to cut the wings off and put the wings along the side. And she did it, and her mother did it, and it came from her grandmother. And they and so someone started to question, well, why do we do this? And they realized that they did that. They cut the wings off and put them on the side because the pot wasn't big enough, right?
Mhm.
That and
Yeah.
that, but that essentially became the tradition of the family versus there's a and no one questioned it. And well, why do we
Yeah.
do this? And no one ever said, hey, let's just get a bigger pot, right? But
Right.
so again, the idea of revisiting, there's nothing
Yes.
wrong with reevaluating. There's nothing wrong with questioning. Like, why do I believe this, and why does that continue to happen? And is there another way? I think those are great questions to ask ourselves.
Yeah, they are. And that's when you grow, right? It's a
Mm,
little bit like looking out at my garden and seeing, oh, there's lots of weeds. And then when I start pulling them up, I realize, oh, I had no idea that this flower was in here and that plant was in there, because it just looked like a bunch of weeds. But when I talk about assumptions, beliefs, and conditioning, I a lot of times will talk about, an iceberg, like the Titanic bumped
sure.
into what they thought was a little tiny iceberg. And it really wasn't. And they really needed to be more aware of what was going on below the surface. And so that's when it gets a little scary for people. But if you're willing to just start and say, all right, well, when I feel conflict, this is the best
Yes.
place to start, right? The very best place to start when you want to have some awareness is, why do I feel conflict with this situation, or this person, or why do I feel an incongruence, like a rubbing on something, or an irritation? And when we start looking at those things, then we start realizing, I assumed this about that situation. And why, and then we say, well, why did I assume that? It's like becomes what I call critical thinking, just very
Yes.
simple stuff, asking why until you get to the bottom of it. And
Mhm.
when you do that, you become more aware of all of the things that are underneath it. People think that people think that their beliefs are the things that they're born with, or but
Yep.
no, your beliefs are changeable. They
Yes.
are based on your conditioning. I mean, ask anybody who's changed religions or political parties. Beliefs are
Yes.
changeable, my friend.
Absolutely.
And our assumptions are based on those beliefs. And our beliefs are based on our conditioning. Some of it is purposeful conditioning, some of it is things we grew up with. I grew up thinking I had no prejudice because I was international.
Gotcha.
Therefore, I don't have any prejudice.
Yeah.
And
Like, how can I be prejudiced? Right.
how
Right.
could
Like,
I possibly be prejudiced? And then it's like you bump into something, and it's like, oh, so maybe I have prejudice about that. It's,
yes.
oh, maybe I have prejudice about that. And I very early on realized that oddly enough, I had a pretty intense prejudice about certain Asian things because I looked down on them as an American. And I had to like work with that. And then it was like living in this place and being around these people, I realized I had kind of developed this conditioning of prejudice in this area, or just a condition. I mean, it's not always prejudice, it's just an assumption. And
Mm,
when we don't do that, then, I mean, when we take it all the way, circle it back to leadership, if a leader's not willing to look, then a
oh,
leader's always going to have blind
yeah.
spot after blind
That's right.
spot after
Yep.
blind spot.
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And we're
No.
never going to be able to meet all our people where they need to be met. We're never going to be able to have, I like to call it magnetic leadership, or have a true impact. And so it's extremely important. And, it's not for the faint of heart. You have to be willing.
Yes, absolutely. I think willingness is a big part of it. We were talking about um experiences, right? We talk about how experiences influence and our leadership style or influence who we are. Um, I'd love to sort of have just conversation around the those challenging experiences, right? Those ones where there's a need to build up our resiliency because it's as a leader, you're never going to get an easy ride. It's never going to be a piece of cake. There will always be something that's challenging, albeit at varying degrees, and maybe that thing at the surface it didn't end up being as big as it thought it was initially, or maybe just vice versa, it became bigger than it was initially. I think in either instance, the leader's job, the expression we oftentimes hear is lead from the front, becomes even more critical, particularly for those that are behind them trying to follow their lead.
Yeah, I'll tell one story that when I moved from an individual contributor, they call them today, to a manager.
Okay.
I moved into a new department, and there were first I moved into one department, and they said, well, these two people you need to manage out. I'm like, that's how you're starting my job here? I mean, I don't do that. And one of them was on like disability, and she just kept, so she was fairly easy. It was just like time, just wait her out.
Hmm.
But the other one was someone that pretty much everybody had written off. And so this is actually, I'll share my positive and then I'll share my negative, but
Okay.
because it was both were good lessons. Um, I looked at her and I started asking questions as like, what is it that you like to do? But people saw her as a loafer. They saw her as somebody who was lazy. They saw her as somebody who wasn't doing their job.
Mm.
And as soon as I started asking her what her interests were and finding out what her strengths were and giving her responsibility and actually giving her some attention, it was like she blossomed. It was like this droopy flower in a pot. And you've seen this, like everybody needs a little rain and
Yeah,
sunshine to
yeah,
grow.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And by the time I left 18 months later, she was well on her way to being a stellar team member. I mean, stellar. And
Love it.
then the people that replaced me went right back to the old stuff. And she went,
Mm.
It's a hard lesson to learn, but I watched her flourish. So it's like, I know it works.
Yes, yes, yes,
But I
yes.
went into my next one, and there was this, she'd been there forever. She was serving the emeritus chair who had come back. It's like doctors don't ever retire, right? They just
Mm.
come back and take up an office space and just keep going. And she was very dedicated to him, and I could never quite nail down what her job description was. And she was really like, she was past retirement age, and she just was prickly.
Okay.
And I'm one of those people, I'm like sunny and I'm happy and I want to include. And
Sure.
I just didn't understand this older woman who was prickly to me. And I had a real hard time. Like, what is it that you do all day? So I began reacting to her rather than doing what I had done with the other woman. And part of that was who was kind of in my ears and training. And by the time I had been there like a year and a half, another 18 months, she finally I mean, I had written her up. We had argued, and I wasn't responsible for moving her into a small closet-like office, but I had to do the work. So I
Yep.
represented all of that.
Hmm.
And exit interview, I just looked at her and I said, I realized I really blew it with our relationship. She goes, yeah, you really did. And I said, I should have come and sat with you and learned what you did. And
Mm.
then I understood and seen what was important. And she said, that would have made a world of difference. And so being willing to take your experiences and say, just because I think I'm supposed to be in charge and I know what I'm supposed to do, I need to give her sunlight and just rain and water,
Right,
just like this
right,
other
right.
woman. No, you
Yeah.
have to be willing to set aside the things that you think are
Yeah.
valid and true, and
Yes.
be willing to see what someone else sees as valid and true.
Yes.
Um, it just, I had experience after experience like that. One one woman who is, I said I was a DISC consultant. So she was a very, if you're not familiar with that, I can explain it later, but she was a very strong S, a steady, doesn't like change, and was very much a team player. And she would go, and this is very common for S's, she would go until she would like explode because she was too busy. And she would explode at me. And I finally had to learn to look for warning signs to help her manage that stress. But you have to be willing to set aside what you think is supposed to be and see people where they are.
Yes.
And when you can do that, the experiences that you've had can start feeding that. It's like learn from your own wisdom, learn from your own mistakes, but also learn from other people's mistakes.
Mm.
So I think being willing to take the experiences that I had, not only as an employee, but even as an international traveler,
Yep.
and say, surely we don't all speak the same language.
Right.
So it's like I have to figure this out, and finally was able to learn some of those things. But that actually helped me make my own decisions.
Well, certainly good on you for recognizing that and being able to actually and own that and say, hey, I did mess up. I did blow it, right? Like, I think
Sure.
that says a lot. I mean, again, how many, I don't think that's common. Like, a lot of people just say, hey, well, and chalk it up. They're leaving. All right. Now on to the next one. And there's more work
Woo!
to be. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. All of that, right? Because
Yes.
technically, I mean, there's no further obligations. But the idea of, I've always loved the concept of exit interviews because they really are beneficial to both sides. They truly, truly are. Because and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm confident that after that experience, that now helps shape and alter what you did moving forward with the next person or the next person
Oh,
after
yeah.
that, right? So,
Well, even if nobody else needed me to sit with them to learn their job, it meant that I had viewed things from my perspective and not hers.
yes, yeah,
And you gave the example of the living room. I like to give to understand perspective. I like to say, let's pretend we have that living room and we have four windows, and you're on that opposite side looking in the window, and I'm on this side looking in the window, and I see the couch.
yes.
And you look across the window and you see the trash can. And I have
Mm,
something I need to throw away. And you're like, just throw it in the trash can. I'm like, all I see is a couch.
what trash dad? That's it.
And you're like, okay, come over here and you can see the trash can, and then you can just drop it in,
Yeah.
or be willing to listen to somebody else and trust them that their perspective is real.
Mm-hmm.
Trust them that their perspective is
Love that.
valid, and just
Oh,
drop
that's
it in the trash can. I mean, it's just like little things like that help us to remember. And that's why I love analogies, like these really good object lessons.
yes.
Hopefully that's like a couple of analogies that will stick in somebody's head to help them say, all right, maybe I need to look at this differently.
Yep, 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 absolutely. And again, I think we've spoken ad nauseam about the importance of perspective, but it certainly is, and being able to look at things differently. But also, I would say how we look at them also is important too. And I want to tie that into something. You speak about intentional optimism.
Mm,
And I think that's a very important in terms of how we see things or how we view things. Of course, the way we view things is how we view the world, and how we view the world, and how we act and move in it accordingly. Talk
right.
about what is intentional optimism and why is it important to leaders?
Well, I call myself the intentional optimist. It is the name of my business, and it just got trademarked. So, yay,
Congratulations.
intentional optimism.
Congratulations. Yes.
Thank you. It came out of losing my mom at 50. The grief process made me really pay attention to, it was a wake-up call, right? At 50, 8-year-old son, I'm not doing what I want to do, so it was part of that process. It was a little bit like a crucible. And I kind of asked myself, who do I want to represent? How do I want to show up? Hopefully I'll have another 50 years. What do I want them to look like?
Yeah.
Who do I want to be? And my mother was one of those vivacious, bubbly, pop the cork champagne kind of people. She'd walk in a room and everybody say, Judy, just like Norm and Cheers.
Cheers.
And she loved everybody, but there were things that she did really well that I might have a little bit of, but a lot of times I'm more realistic. She was just she could be sanguine about anything. She could delight and joy in just about anything.
Yeah.
And she had this effervescence to her. And so I started looking at how I'm wired, who I am, how I was created to be, what my mission was. And I said, you know what? I kind of want to be a little bit different than I've been, because I have this bent towards um, not necessarily pessimism. I call it realism. Like I can see everything that's going to go wrong and I can tell you how and why and when. But what I want to do is be able to say, yep, seeing all that is really nice. Let's navigate it this way, right? To be more purposeful. So intentional optimism, I dumped everything into a big spreadsheet and I started separating it out and saying, what are these categories of traits that I want to live? And it came down to 6 main tenets, I call them.
Okay.
And um, and I said, this is, and that's where I started. We all start a lot of times outside ourselves and work in.
Yes.
And it came down to these 6 tenets, and I started sharing them, and they are optimistic. So that's bookend, right? So this means I'm hopeful, confident, proactive,
Okay.
present, meaning I have a sense of wonder. It's more than just being where my feet are, as Bob Goff says. It's
Mm-hmm.
excitement and being life focused to talk about people flourishing. Energetic, which
Yes.
includes an attitude of industry, always looking for the next thing. How can we
Okay.
make it better? What kind of generosity can I throw in there,
Yep.
and share that joy with others? Fourth one is courageous. And this is where leadership really comes in. We have to be willing to be out front, like that goose out in the front. We have to
Yes.
be willing to go on adventures and say, I really don't know what this road's going to look like, but I'm willing to do what it takes to make it happen. And this is also where resiliency comes in. Falling
Yes.
down, getting back up, building that muscle of getting back up one more time than we fall down. The fifth one is the one, oddly, that I recognized it was there, and we talked about it a little bit earlier, especially in the travel area. But I just was somehow I knew that I wanted to embody wisdom,
Okay.
and people would come to my office and listen, and I would listen to them, and they would talk to me, say, "Why are you coming here?" Well, it's a safe place, and so
Mm.
I realized that wisdom was something that this many times around the sun and the travel and who I am, there was some wisdom there that I need to start sharing. And it
Right.
includes being understanding, respectful, being careful with my words, which
Yes.
that's not always the thing. My tongue is really fast. But wisdom is the fifth one. And then it kind of is bookended with intentionality, being purposeful, planning, growing
Yes.
on purpose. We never grow by accident unless
No.
we're like under 10 or well, my son is 15, he's still growing. So I mean, that kind of once we get out of high school or college or hit our
Yep.
20s, we have to be intentional about growing. And if you fail to plan, you plan to fail, I
Mm.
mean, so that's the 6 tenets of intentional optimism. And I say it's the mindsets and attitudes that I embody to live out my goals and dreams with excellence.
What I find very interesting is those 6. So thank you for sharing that because it's first of all it's very 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 practical, and I love the fact that it's just easy to digest. And there's nothing that you said there that no
Mhm.
one go, oh, what is that? We all can
Right.
relate, and part of that being able to relate is because we can see practical applications in our own life, right? And
Mm.
so if you can see that, then you can understand that better. And going back, I think I said earlier, like people want to make the distinction between I'm a leader now I'm this person in my personal life when they really overlap and they're one and the same, and you can't make that
Yes.
distinction.
Yeah.
Um, the yes, I was gonna say, but as far the six of them goes, those tenants they vary. Like you can the entry point is different. Like you don't have to necessarily be here before you can go there. You can
No.
like
Right.
maybe you're already really good at being curious and living life with excitement, right? And maybe that's already a part of your core values, because that's the other part of all this too, that some of these
Yeah.
things already exist inside of us, and maybe they need a bit more nurturing or cultivating to grow and become bigger and better, sure, but they are there. And so the idea is it's not like you have to do them all in succession. It's like you could do
Nope.
here, and maybe you can start with this one, and you can build those muscles up at different points. And I think that's the beauty of what you just described.
Well, thank you. That's really the way I describe it too. It's almost like the 6-piece Venn diagram, that kind of goes, they overlap and they touch. It's like a spider web. When you're generous, then you can be generous with yourself, not just with others, and it helps you with your resilience. When you're willing to have a purpose and do things with purpose, that helps your leadership style, not just you. And so I even tell people, like I had a recent podcast episode because I tell people that I start out working with their core values. We look at how they communicate all of that, and then we look at how we're going to live them out. I call them a set of life principles. And if you don't have a set of life principles of your own, borrow mine. It will work for you, or you can adjust it how you need it to. And if there's something that like you said, if there's one place that I just need more courage,
Yep.
tap into that and
Yep.
let the other ones feed it, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Let them
Yeah.
show you how, oh, well, I already make a lot of plans. So now I just need a little excitement to help me execute
Yes.
those plans and
Yep.
be a leader and step into adventure. So thank you.
Yeah, it's very much like building on one another, right? Really, which is a beautiful thing.
yeah, yeah. And it just one of those. Get that. Oh, try again. Sorry, my watch is very helpful. Um, but it's just one of those things that's the last piece that I help people integrate. And I started off with that because it's so easy to say, this is a life plan, do this.
Yes. Yes.
In order to do it, you have to be willing to look at your ABCs. You have to be willing to look at how you communicate. You have to be willing to do that. So now I put that in as like my third step, but it's all part and parcel. Wherever it's kind of all designed to meet you where you are. And
Yes.
so I
Yeah.
hope this is an encouraging message. And for anybody listening, you don't have to be a leader right now. You can be a leader later, but I
Sure.
promise you lead somewhere. You lead your kids, you
Yes.
lead your family, you might lead in the PTA or at your church. And these are things that will benefit you and others. And so when you look at your life and you say, how do I either keep other people from growing or help other people grow, this is an opportunity to say, I'm going to step into that category. Even
Yeah.
if it's the kids, even if it's, because you have young children. Like I said, mine's 15 and I'm still learning how to communicate with a 15-year-old boy. It's like, I've never been one before. And so, all those things come into play, and being able to see them work in my life, in my family, in my work, in my clients.
Yep.
I love it. And so, for those listening, Audley's doing a great job. He summarized it all for you to be able to see that. So, I mean, if you haven't, you need to give him a 5-star review because he's
Thank you.
curious and he's asking really good questions and he's
Thank you.
getting all the little juicy pieces for you.
Oh, thank you, thank you. Well, I appreciate that, and thanks for the plug with the 5-star review. I'll ask them to at the end of the podcast. But yes, thank you for doing that.
He'll be reminded.
Yes, exactly. It's you sort of touched on the point when people get into leadership roles, and I really think that you did make the point, like, you can be a leader now. You don't have to be in a designated role before you can be a leader. And I actually really believe that being in that, once you get in that designated leadership role, it gives you an opportunity to put all the things in practice you've been doing up until that point.
Mhm.
Because again, there's no distinction between who we are and the leader that we become. I think
Right.
they are one and the same. And so
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of that. I'm also, so I'm a fan of acronyms, and so I have what I call the BOLD framework, and the BOLD framework gives individuals an opportunity to live their own best audacious life, and it's quite simple. The B stands for better than you were yesterday, right? So it's about the idea of, we had accomplishments. So I climbed that mountain yesterday, and it was fantastic, and I got to the peak. But that mountain, the top of that mountain, is really the bottom of a new one. So where am I
Yeah.
going from here? And not to say we can't celebrate our successes. We absolutely should celebrate the things that we do and give ourselves credit and feel good about them, but also not rest on that and go, okay, well, that's cool. Like, sure. So in grade 5, you won your Little League championship. Now as an adult, what does that mean to you? Like, you move on, right? Because life sort of progresses. The ONAT framework stands for Outlast Adversity. And I think we talked a little bit about adversity, and challenges are going to come, recognizing that nothing is forever. And in this moment, it might be hard, it might be difficult, it might hurt, it might suck, but it doesn't last forever.
Mm.
So we're talking about it. I think we've thrown out at least a half a dozen analogies between the two of us in this conversation. I'm gonna give you another one. Another one of my listeners have heard too, about the hills and valleys of life. Right at the top of the hill, we celebrate. It's great. We have a great time. We enjoy ourselves. But as that continuum of life continues, we kind of go down that valley, and the valley is the icky place. And so, the onus is on us is to realize what we need to do to get out of that valley as quickly as we possibly can, so we can back on top of that hill and celebrate where it's good again.
Mm,
So that's that. So we're talking about outlast adversity, recognizing that it's not forever. The L is
mm.
live your truth, and it's really about authenticity. And I know we didn't talk on it specifically, but I think there's aspects of it we
Yeah.
definitely touched on in terms of your real self versus your leadership self. I think they're one and the same. And so if you're authentic to who you are, you can be an authentic leader.
Mm.
And then the last, the D in that framework is disrupt the norm. And that's really about, breaking those, being at your own trailblazer.
Yeah.
The Wright brothers, I'm sure many people laughed at them when they were trying to, invent the plane. People thought, what are you doing? Like, people shouldn't fly. Birds are fly. We belong on the
Right.
ground. That's not what we're capable of. It can't happen. It's impossible. Stop it. And now flying is a part of our existence, a big part of our
Yeah.
existence. And so
Absolutely.
the bold framework very much encapsulates much of what you've talked about and much of what
Yeah.
you identified. And I think when we sort of, and again, I sort of summarize by saying this is how you can live your best audacious life ever, by being bold. And so
Yeah.
I wanted to share because there's definitely some overlaps there.
Absolutely. And, for sure, like I'm all about that disrupt the norm.
Yeah.
I am a disruptor. And, there are times that that without someone doing that, oddly,
Yes,
everything will stay the same.
that's correct.
And, I did leave a little bit of a hole when I left the university in my job.
Mhm.
But quite honestly, they've managed to normalize again, right? And it's like, but I'm offering different things. I've gone from doing the things that other people thought I should do to the things that I believe I am called to do. And in
Mm.
order to do that, I even had to disrupt my own norms. The things that, I mean, my mother-in-law looked at me, she said, "Why are you quitting a job in the middle of COVID?" And I'm like, I just have to, you know? And so I love this. And one of the things that I do talk about, it, we didn't really actually talk about that much, is being an authentic leader is letting people see your fumbles, letting people see your questions,
Yep.
letting people see your curiosity, letting people see your excitement over
Yep.
something,
Yep.
all
Yep.
of it. Right? We don't have to be fully transparent. There's certain things as a leader that you have to not be transparent about.
Right.
But
Right.
most of the time, when you are yourself, people are attracted to you.
Sure, sure. And Andrea, even in those moments when you can't say this, there's information I can't share with you, even if you're real about that, people will not
Yes.
understand. They'll say, okay,
Yes.
right? But if you commit to, when the opportunity presents itself, I will, and here's what, and you follow through on those commitments, people will understand that piece of information is missing. They'll accept
Right.
it. So
And they'll start trusting you, which
yes.
means then they will support you, and then you can work together to make things better.
Awesome, awesome. I would be remiss if we didn't give. I know you made reference to your podcast, but
Mm.
certainly, if you would give you an give you an opportunity to share a little bit about your podcast, and what listeners can expect to hear from you.
Sure. My podcast is called Stand Tall and Own It, which is, yes, just a little bit of a play on my height, but I'm in the third, almost fourth year of it. And it originally was called Intentional Optimists, Unconventional Leaders. And
Okay.
what I was on a quest to do was to find women that didn't think they were leaders, but I could show a different side of leadership. So I did over 75 interviews. And if
Beautiful.
you go back to my really old ones, you'll hear like a lot of teaching on intentional optimism. And I learned so much from these women that I realized I needed to do a little bit of a pivot, and I needed to take that wisdom that I was learning, and I needed to actually own who I was, because it's one thing, Holly, to teach. This is how you're
Yes.
transparent. This is how you
Yes.
understand your core values. This is how you lead,
Yes.
But if you don't do it yourself, people will figure that out. So part of my rebranding into Stand Tall and Own It was to actually hit those marks, right? To say, these are the things that I have come to understand. And so now I do some interviews that are just a little bit different, but you will find a lot of encouragement in there, a lot of practical advice. It is catered towards women, but I actually have had I have my first male interview, and so he was phenomenal. But even just tackling things like, look, women in leadership, a lot of us, I don't personally, but a lot of women in leadership, they have ADHD. A lot of leaders do. We need to normalize those kinds of things. So when you're looking for a podcast that can both encourage you and give you some practical advice, that's where you'll find it. My website, though, is theintentionaloptimist.com. As I said, I'm a Maxwell leadership speaker, trainer, and coach. And so you'll find things in there about the things that I offer, different types of coaching, different types of assessments. I'm putting on a local Live to Lead conference here in Charlottesville. So there are options for online versions of that. And so I just invite you to have a conversation. Let me know. The other thing is you can talk to me through LinkedIn or Instagram messaging. If you tell me that you heard me here on Audley's podcast, I'll know it's not spam and I'll respond because I manage all of those accounts. I'm a woman show.
Yeah.
And so I would love to hear from you. What resonated? What piece of encouragement really helped you? And I would love to hear from you.
Amazing. We'll also make sure that all the details are in the show notes below for our listeners, and they can connect with you directly. I would certainly encourage them to do so. Andrea, this has been great. Honestly, this is a fabulous time with you. I really appreciate the insights, the perspectives. I think for me, the perspectives, really, that piece around perspective that we had, that dialogue we had around that is really going to resonate with me because I do just see so much value in that because it opens the way for so many great things to happen. So thank you for that. Thank you for being here. Congratulations on the great job and all the best.
Thank you so much. It has been my pleasure.
Back we are here on the podcast. Thank you so much, Andrea, for being here. It was a pleasure to chat with you. When I think about our conversation, the key takeaway from our chat is that by challenging assumptions and beliefs, leaders can foster resilience and embrace diverse perspectives, ultimately becoming more effective in the long run. To connect with Andrea directly, please refer to the contact details provided in the show notes below. I'd like to thank you for tuning in to the Audacious Living Podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please like, follow, subscribe, or share if you haven't already done so, because that's how we grow this podcast and continue to inspire other listeners to live their most audacious lives. Until next time, stay safe, be kind, show love to one another, and be audacious.
You've been listening to the Audacious Living Podcast, hosted by Audley Stephenson. If you enjoyed what you heard, be sure to like, subscribe, and share. Until next time, be audacious.